Hello, my name is Andrew Saywell and I'm the Secretary for Truth in Science, and I'm also the pastor of a small independent Baptist church here in Folkestone. And I'd like to consider with you in this lecture the subject, how did life begin? And does modern science support the origin of life by naturalistic means? How did life begin? I do believe that this is possibly the greatest scientific question of all time. But before we answer this question, we need to establish some certain well-known facts. And first of all, that all life, as we know it, is coded by DNA. Whether it's a bacteria or a plant or a human being, we are coded, that those life processes are all coded by DNA. The one exception perhaps is the coronavirus, which has RNA, but this itself has the same genetic code as DNA. All life as we know it comes from life. And again, whether it's in the laboratory or in the field, there is not a single incident that has been shown where life can arise by abiogenesis, from something that's non-living. But how and where did the first living cell arise? I admit that it's a very difficult question to answer, partly because we don't have the raw data. But this was a question that was something in my own life personally. Back in 1984, I was studying my A-levels, and I thought this thought: if I could find out how life began, I might know what life is and what life is about. A very deep question. All my teachers told me that I needed to study biochemistry. And so I bought this little book called The Chemistry of Life by Professor Stephen Rose at Oxford University. And it was very much eye-opening, because it was there in that book that I discovered that life was much, much more complex than I had previously imagined it to be. I had been influenced by a series called Life on Earth in 1979 with Sir David Attenborough. I was very influenced by that particular program, and one episode in particular when David went down into the Grand Canyon and he looked at these various layers of rock, and he said this, that each layer in the rock strata represents something like 1,000,000 years. And as we go deeper into the canyon, we're going back in time to the beginning of life itself. Well, so it was, I went on to study biochemistry at the University College of Swansea, and I thought it was only a matter of time before I would have an answer to that big question, how did life begin? But sadly, not one of my lecturers was able to give me a definitive answer to that question. And I had other questions also arising at this time. How could protein synthesis have happened by chance? DNA codes for the protein, but the protein as an enzyme is involved both in translation and transcription and all the other processes that go on in protein synthesis. So again, I had a whole range of new questions. This is the biochemistry textbook I had by Jeffrey Zubey, and in chapter 32 it's entitled The Origins of Life, and this was the final straw that led me to reject the theory of evolution. The reason being is, you can see on the contrary page a picture of a comet, and the idea went that we cannot understand how life began here on Earth, and so perhaps it occurred in outer space and on comets, which then seeded the Earth with the life-giving chemicals or even life itself. Well, it was then independently in December of 1985 at a Christian Union carol service that I heard a man called Bob Parsons speak on the subject of why Jesus came into the world. And it was at that carol service that I was wonderfully converted to Jesus Christ and became a Christian. And this had a deep impact on my studies, because everything now made sense. The original frustrations and unanswered questions all made sense when I considered this, that this world is designed. The natural world is created, and creation fitted the complexity of life like a hand fits into a glove. I had previously been trying to put a foot into a glove and it didn't quite fit, but now everything fitted perfectly. So I like to consider the subject of evolution. And the evolution tries to explain the origin of life. But, however, the origin of life is the blind spot of evolution. It cannot explain how life actually began. And I say this for three reasons. First of all, it cannot explain how these complex molecules organise themselves, how amino acids join together to form the proteins. It cannot explain how cells with all their internal complexity arose, which was necessary if you're going to get something like reproduction, because it cannot explain how the very first cell was able to replicate itself. Or in other words, it has no biochemistry, no cells, and no means of reproduction. And so neither Darwin nor any of his many followers can tell us, even to this day, how life could have come from non-life. So let us follow the fairy tale of how life supposedly began millions of years ago. It is commonly taught that the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Now, even this statement is like once upon a time. There is no evidence that the Earth is that old. In fact, the only evidence, supposedly, that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old is from a meteorite that landed somewhere in Antarctica and through some dubious dating methods has been put down to 4.5 billion years. But supposedly, the Earth was some kind of molten mass, but then it cooled sufficiently that life was able to form on the planet. But there's another thing that's required for life, and that is water. Where did that come from? Well, it's further believed that comets themselves supplied the water that is now found in all the oceans. But even this has been proved to be untrue, because water has a fingerprint. It has a certain amount of deuterium, which is an isotope, a stable isotope of hydrogen. And there is far too much deuterium in comets than in the oceans itself, proving that it doesn't come from comets. Supposedly, the atmosphere at this time didn't have any oxygen. The plants had not evolved, and they supposedly, through certainly the photosynthetic bacteria, over millions of years supplied the oxygen to the atmosphere. But the early life, when life began, there was no oxygen. And these chemicals began to form in these newly formed seas, including many of the organic molecules like amino acids. And so it comes down to this, that in one of these small pools of water, life began. This is what Charles Darwin said in a letter in 1887. If, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc. present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. At the present day, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed. So let's examine this thought of Charles Darwin. We know this, that amino acids do not spontaneously bind together without the help of these biological catalysts made of protein called enzymes. A protein forms, or a peptide forms, through a peptide bond. The oxygen and hydrogen of one of the carboxylic acid groups of the amino acid binds together with the hydrogen from the amino group of another amino acid, and this takes out water. And so you can see the peptide bond is formed by something called a condensation reaction. Now this shows you that water is removed. Now you've got these amino acids in water, so water is not favourable for peptide bond formation, and this is found to be true in the laboratory today. So to work against this dissociation, you need energy. And energy in the form of ATP, which we know is something that's made by biological machines in the mitochondria. And also something called enzymes, which are, of course, proteins. But more importantly, we have found that in the natural world that proteins are actually made by very complex molecular machines called ribosomes. In 1952, Miller and Urey set up an experiment that aimed to mimic the early Earth. I liken it to the SETI program, which also is trying to find out how life began, or is there life on other planets. This experiment had a reducing atmosphere, there's no oxygen, and also sparks, etc. And they put through certain simple compounds like ammonia and like Darwin had suggested. And what they found was this. They did find that there was certain brown sludge. But before we try to analyse what that sludge was, there is an assumption made here. And that assumption is that the early Earth had a reducing atmosphere. But hang on a minute. If there is no oxygen, then there's no ozone. Oxygen being O2, ozone being O3. And this goes up into the stratosphere and protects all life against the harmful UV radiation that comes from the sun. Secondly, the products which were this organic soup contained only a few of the amino acids needed for making proteins. But the problem was they were the wrong kind of amino acids to form proteins. Let me explain. Amino acids themselves are mirror images of one another. And there is the left-hand form and the right-hand form. Both types of these amino acids form in a 50-50 ratio in something like the Miller-Urey experiment. These cannot form proteins. Let me explain why. First of all, we have found in the laboratory that only 1 or 2% of the right-handed form will cause any protein that's being formed to actually break apart. We've already seen that peptide bonds involve the removal of water. But thirdly, and this is the most important part, is we know that all biological proteins are made by complex molecular machines. Here is such a molecular machine. It's called a ribosome. And we have thousands of these in our cells. And these are very, very complex biological machines. They're made of RNA and they're also made of protein. Now, ribosomes act a little bit like a tape recorder. They decode something called messenger RNA. So messenger RNA comes from the nucleus itself. It's transcribed. It's one side of a copy of DNA. This then leaves through the nuclear pore membrane into the cytoplasm where it finds these ribosomes. But there are other types of RNA, something called tRNA, and these have a code themselves. They bind to the amino acids in the cytoplasm and they bring the amino acid into the ribosome itself, binding to the codon, the code in the messenger RNA. And so it is the amino acids are brought together in the right sequence. Of course, we need ATP to form the peptide bond. And this is something that's made in a very complex way, which we haven't got time to go into in this lecture. But the ribosome is just like a tape recorder, therefore. The messenger RNA is like the tape containing the information. And as it passes the tape head, the information is read or processed to make the music, the sound. Well, a ribosome is very much like a tape recorder, but there are 30 millionths of a millimetre across, 30 nanometres. So there would be about 9 billion of these to make the same size of a tape recorder. And yet they are as complex as such a machine. But unlike tape recorders which use electricity, ribosomes run on ATP. And this needs to be present in the very first primitive cell. And so when we look at the science, we see that science actually refutes evolution, particularly at the origins of life. Biochemistry is considered as being the biggest challenge to evolution in the modern day. So the complex world of biochemistry and molecular biology cannot give us an answer to our question: how did life begin? Let's look for a moment at the Earth. The Earth is the only planet with life. And the reason for this, some say, is because Earth has water in a liquid state. Earth has 71% water coverage. And so the thought is that water is essential for all living things. Certainly in my biochemistry textbook, the comet has frozen water, though we now know that comets are only a small percentage of ice. But the recipe for life comes down as simple as this. All you need is water, amino acids, and a few minerals. And hey presto, you're bound to have life. And so we look at the planets and we find that perhaps they once had water. Did Mars, for example, once have water on its surface? Quite possibly. But does that mean that there is life on Mars? So here is some mock-up pictures of what Mars may have looked like from 3 to 1 billion years ago to the present day. Again, hypothetical. Another thought for the study of life: is there life under the icy crust of Europa? Europa is one of the 4 large moons that are closest to Jupiter. There are other moons, of course. And it's thought that under Europa there is an ocean of water. Well, where there's water, there must be life. And so NASA are planning to go to Europa and burrow through the ice to discover the supposed life under the crusty surface. There is another search for life, not just on our own planets, but on exoplanets as well. Here is a news item a year or so ago.
For the first time, scientists have identified water on a planet outside the solar system, suggesting it could support life. But although the potentially habitable superworld has water in its atmosphere, even I'm excited, it's not exactly like the world we know. And scientists hope next generation telescopes can help them uncover the secrets of mysterious Earth-like planets.
The night sky is littered with stars, light years past the planets in our own solar system. We now know that they too are suns with their own worlds in orbit around them. Might some of them be like our own Earth and home to life? Scientists think that there's a chance that this one might be, orbiting around a small red sun 650 million miles away. Astronomers have discovered more than 4,000 planets orbiting distant stars. The new one is about the right distance from its sun to be able to support life. Its temperature is between 0 and 40 degrees Celsius. It's around twice the size of our own Earth, and it has an atmosphere that we now know contains water. So the big question is whether there really are living organisms on this world.
Well, this planet has the name B218b, and it's 110 light years away. But that's a bit of a problem, because it would take us over 1 million years to get there. But the idea there, as you can see, all that you need water, and then you'd have life. There is a washing machine sized structure that landed on a comet. It's called Philae, and it landed on a comet. I'm not going to try and pronounce this word, but the idea is from Rosetta, which caught up with the comet. It ejected this module which landed on the surface. It bounced off the surface. The gravity is so low, and it bounced into a shadow area, and it was a bit disappointing. But as it came in towards the sun, the solar panels recharged the batteries, and they were able to burrow through into the ice in the hope of finding organic molecules and life itself. Unfortunately, they didn't find life. But again, the whole idea that life has the thought that comets may have been the depository of life that seeded the earth is still very much the current thought. Now, as I say, you can't get more cutting edge than NASA, but they cannot give us an answer to our question: how did life begin? The great enemy of science, as I say, is the fairy tale of evolution. There are those within evolution are self-appointed experts in origins. This pseudoscience describes how man arose from a fish. Here is a mock-up of that kind of change. But even that fish itself was once something as small as a bacteria, as the first living cell. But it's a pseudoscience, and so here is one of your ancestors. Of course, it's a mud skipper which lifts itself up out of the water and is able to breathe for a short period of time on the land as well. In answer to the question which came first, the chicken or the egg, the evolutionists would say an amoeba. But the real question should be this: which came first, the protein or the DNA that codes for the protein? Of course, we now know that this is a very complex process, as we've mentioned already. And here there were at least 4 Nobel Prizes for discovering how this whole mechanism works. Let me make it a lot simpler for you. DNA codes for proteins, but proteins are needed to facilitate the transcription and translation necessary for protein synthesis. So what came first, the protein or the DNA? In fact, it is much more complex than that, because the complexity doesn't stop there. There are certain proteins, this is my favourite protein called kinesin, a motor protein. It operates under the ATP, and it walks along these little microfibrils, and they do so to transport the newly made proteins into another area of the cell where it's going to get folded into a defined shape. But all this requires that energy in the form of ATP. And so DNA is like the software, and proteins and ribosomes are like the hardware. DNA, the software; protein, the hardware. Both are needed at the same time, in the same way that a computer, the hardware, needs the software to operate it. Now, of course, we know that complex machines, for them to work, they need both designers and engineers. Well, how much more then for the biological machines that are essential to life, even more complex than the things that we ourselves can make? So our conclusion comes to this: that life has been shown can only come from life. Evolution says that life came from non-life, that something like a rock or a stone evolved into something that's living. But we know that life can only come from life. This is a process here of mitosis, asexual reproduction, but all life must come from life. And we know that even the simplest life requires a minimum of 265 genes to code for the hundreds of proteins that are necessary for replication and of reproduction itself. So there's not a single element of hard scientific evidence that can account for life to have started from mere naturalistic means. This is a 100% proven fact. And we might even go on to say, 160 years on since Darwin wrote his infamous novel, there has been no scientific account that can account for how life started. A proven fact. So when you see precision engineering, it is reasonable to deduce creation by design. It fits all the data and it does offer an explanation. Organisations like Truth in Science find that science and faith fit together. Our argument all the way through here is that from evidence-based science is how we can explain the origin of life. Evidence-based science can't explain the origin of life, only creation can. And so this is where we argue from, and yet we do have saving faith. And so we have what I would say a reasonable faith. Christianity is a reasonable faith. We believe in the authority and complete inerrancy of the Word of God. We believe it to have historical accuracy and scientific reliability. And so it does make sense that life itself is created.